Hi Year 6, I'm back again for today's 2 chapters of from Letters from the Lighthouse. Okay, so chapter 7, Lend a Hand on the Land. Breakfast is for time wasters, we've got work to do, Queenie announced the next morning. She'd woken us so early it wasn't yet light, and we were standing in the post office, washed and dressed and bleary-eyed, wondering what the heck was going on. After a restless night considering Suki's note, I decided to speak to Queenie as soon as I could. First, though, we simply had to eat. Don't worry, we can eat breakfast in 2 minutes flat, I reassured her. Less than 2 minutes, added Cliff. But there was no sign of breakfast. Not even a cup of tea. Queenie, I decided, was in league with the enemy. No one British would starve children like this. As for time wasting, I wasn't sure how she'd tell. The clock on the wall above the counter said 2:10 and was as dead as a doorknob. Yet, despite my reservations about Queenie, the shop itself looked normal. Rows of pigeonhole-type shelves to hold mail lined the walls. On the counter sat enormous weighing scales and a box displaying hair combs for sale. It was the sort of place that sold anything and everything. The stock stood at the very front of the shelves, hiding the empty space behind. There were tins, shoe polish, peas, pilchards, packets of soap flakes, dried beans, broken biscuits by the bag, and, I gulped hungrily, a glass-domed cake stand. On it were currant buns, yesterday's at least by the looks of them. As Cliff ambled over to inspect the buns, I seized my chance. I need to talk to you, Queenie, I said, dropping my voice, about my sister. She's got a boyfriend, and I think they might have been planning to run away and... Good grief, Queenie interrupted sharply. Don't tell me Gloria is sending her here too. What? I was confused. No, I didn't mean... All right, one each, she called to Cliff, who, having lifted the dome off the cake stand, now had Queenie's full attention. I wanted to ask her what she'd meant about Suki. It was an odd remark to make about a friend. But the buns took over. True to our word, they didn't last 2 minutes. That morning I started my delivery job. In daylight, Budmouth Point looked prettier than I'd supposed. It wasn't a dump, like Esther had said. There was a school, a church, a baker's shop, rows of little white cottages set into the hillside. Most of the larger houses were on the main street, which ran steeply down to a harbour. Beyond it, perched at the end of a long cobbled wall, was the lighthouse. I was to take groceries and post to those who, for whatever reason, couldn't collect it themselves. Cliff, being younger and weedier, was to help serve customers in the shop. Queenie made him wear an apron that fell to his ankles, while I had to carry a leather delivery bag. She told us that though today was our first day, she'd expect us to be as quick as the Jensen boys had been because customers shouldn't be kept waiting. Before I went, she gave me 2 extra bits of advice. The first was, ignore people if they stare. It's the Budmouth way. I've lived here all my life and they still gawp at me like I'm an intruder. I wondered if it had more to do with her than with her sweaters. And, she added, if you've ever reason to be on the beach, don't go past the last groin. She meant one of those wooden fence things that ran out into the sea. Why not? Cliff asked. Quicksands. They'll swallow you whole before you've a chance to even scream. It's a far worse death than drowning in the sea, so people say. Cliff's eyes went owl-wide. Wow! As he turned to me, I guessed what he was about to ask. No, we're not going down there. Don't even think about it, I told him very firmly. Delivering was surprisingly hard work. By the end of the first day, my calf muscles ached like mad, but it was a great way to get to know the layout of the village. At supper, bread and dripping, only 1 slice each, Queenie told me I was indeed as fast as the Jensen boys. Then she left us to clear away, so I didn't get the chance to ask about Suki. After we'd done the dishes and were up in the attic by ourselves, I decided to show Cliff the coded note. We were sitting cross-legged on my bed. It was dark by then, and the torch batteries were on the blink, but we could just about see the numbers and letters on the page. Cliff bent over the note eagerly, though it gave me a bad feeling seeing it again, because I was sure it had something to do with Suki's disappearance. "Tatty, isn't it?" Cliff remarked. "It got wet in the air raid," I explained. "What do you think it says?" "It's not another love letter, is it?" he said, holding it at arm's length. "It's a funny sort of love letter if it is," I remarked. "Well, it's not telephone numbers," he said. "Or place names?" I didn't think so. Really, Cliff had no more of an idea than I did. "It's probably just a silly joke she had with one of her friends," I decided. Taking the note from him, I hid it at the very back of my sock drawer, though that didn't stop it troubling me. "You've an extra delivery today," Queenie told me on Friday, slipping a small package into the bag. "Chicken for Mrs. Drummond on 4 Salters Terrace. Tell her it's all I could get, though it might not be right." "That's at the very top of the village, isn't it?" I asked, just to check. As the week had gone on, I'd got to know my way round the back lanes and cut-throughs. I had the sense Queenie was getting used to us too. Begrudgingly, and rather badly, she'd even started to cook for us. Yet, apart from meal times, I didn't see that much of her. She'd either be in the shop or down in the cellar. When I tried asking about my sister, she'd stare at me blankly, as if she'd forgotten who Suki was. Other times, she'd cut across me with some delivery detail or job that needed doing. That Friday morning was a case in point. Mrs. Drummond will need to return yesterday's bacon, all right? Dr. Morrison's housekeeper says she'll have it on her meat ration, so if you could take it there, please. Not wanting to carry it all the way round, I left Mrs. Drummond's delivery until almost last. The hill leading up from the village was long and steep, but well worth the climb. The view to the sea was spectacular from up here, and I walked the final steps backwards just to savour it. The lighthouse, painted in red and white stripes, looked like something from a fairground. Even with its light on, it stood out for miles against the grey rocks and dark sea. But then, I suppose that was the idea, which is why recently the German pilots had taken a liking to it. As they often did when I was tired, my thoughts took a funny turn. Perhaps, like the lighthouse, there were people who were meant to stand out, who were made to be noticed and make a difference. It brought me slap bang to Suki. All week I'd savoured doing the delivery round as a time when my brain went blissfully blank, and yet back at Queenie's I'd looked at Suki's note to say so many times the paper was wearing thin. It had to be a secret of some sort. Why else would it be written in code? I'd no idea. My sister had liked raspberry jam on toast and left long brown hairs in our sink that blocked the plug hole. She'd slept late on Saturdays, turned the wireless up loud when a dance tune came on. But when I thought of her now, it was like there was this whole other Suki I didn't know, and it frightened me. Taking a deep breath, I turned away from the sea. Salters Terrace was easy to spot. It was the last row of stone cottages in Budmouth Point. To my surprise and dismay, standing outside number 4 was Esther Jenkins. She was leaning against the wall, one leg tucked up behind her. Her face was blotchy, like she'd been crying again. I wanted to ask if she was all right, but she looked so awfully fierce, I didn't have the nerve. "Can you give this to Mrs. Drummond, please?" I asked, hating how small I sounded. I held out the parcel of chicken. "Give it to her yourself," Esther said flatly. "The old witch is inside." I stared at her, appalled, but a little bit impressed. Then I noticed the suitcase on the doorstep, a school blazer and hat slung across it. "Are you staying here?" I asked. "Not if I can help it, no." Snatching up her things, Esther disappeared off down the hill. Mrs. Drummond came to the door almost straight away. I recognised her from the village hall the other night. She was the woman who'd stayed with Esther while she cried. "That girl is impossible," she sighed, gazing past me into the street. "Where's she gone? Did you see her?" She just went off." I wasn't sure what else to say. "Here's your delivery from the shop, and Queenie says, can you return yesterday's bacon?" "Right you are. 'Tis a shame to waste it." Taking the chicken, she turned to go back inside for the bacon, but something caught her attention and she froze. "Listen to that," she said, finger raised. "Planes," I frowned. "Planes?" What, like aeroplanes? German ones, I'll bet you, on their way to bomb poor Plymouth again. Mrs. Drummond was right. There on the wind was the unmistakable drone of aircraft. A familiar dread grew in the pit of my stomach. I'd better go, I said, and hurried away, anxious to find Cliff. Chapter 8. Loose lips sink ships. As I ran down the main street, other people were coming out of their houses. Women still tying on pinnies, old men in undervests, children rubbing the sleep from their eyes. I was glad to find Cliff almost immediately, standing with Queenie on the steps of the post office. I tried to hurry him back inside, thinking the cellar would be a good place to shelter. "Oh, give over, Olive," Cliff cried. "No one else is going in." Incredibly, there was no air raid warden, nor any sign of one on their way. We might as well have been watching a horse race or a carnival procession for how relaxed everyone seemed. Determined not to leave Cliff on his own, I muttered crossly how foolish it was not to go inside. Everyone was gazing out to sea. It was a bright winter's day, the sun so low and glary you had to shield your eyes, yet the dark shapes of the Luftwaffe were clearly visible in the sky. "If Jerry bombs my cabbages," said a man with shaving foam still on his cheeks, "he'll have me to answer to." "Oh, Jim," Mrs. Moore, who ran the bakery, called across the street. "They're heading for Plymouth. You daft Apeth, not your garden." What bothered me was the planes were getting closer and louder. There were 6 of them, one out in front, 2 flying higher, 2 directly below, one bringing up the rear. They flew parallel to the coast, close enough to see the distinctive black crosses on the plane's sides, close enough to be almost level with the long, low platform of rocks on which stood the lighthouse. "Let's go, Cliff," I said again. "In a minute," he shrugged off my arm. "This is the cat's bananas." "They're German fighter planes, real ones," I said through gritted teeth. "It's not some film at the Picture Palace." I didn't like that he'd used Suki's phrase either and got it wrong. Someone shouted, "Look, they're turning inland by the lighthouse." Just a few hundred feet above the lighthouse, the German formation was changing shape. "That bleeding lighthouse," said old Mr. Watkins, whose tobacco ration I delivered every day. "Them Jerry pilots are using it to find their way. Look at them, clear as day they are." "Not surprised," Mrs. Moore replied. "Stands out like a beacon." I watched in despair as the first plane turned almost at right angles. The others followed close on its tail. It was obvious that they were, like the man said, using the lighthouse to guide them in. Out of the corner of my eye I saw Queenie bend down and pick something up off the ground. Within moments, the sky above us darkened. Everyone cowered down. I grabbed Cliff and we clung to each other. It was terror on my part, though Cliff was grinning madly. At little more than roof height, the planes went over. You could see numbers on their undersides. The sections of metal held together with rivets. The stench of burning engine fuel made my throat catch. And the noise! It was so horribly high-pitched, I thought my ears would burst. "Jeez!" Cliff yelled. I couldn't bear to look any more. It was then I noticed Queenie. She was the only person in the street not cowering. Her arm raised, she was hurling stones at the planes. I don't know if she hit them. It was her face that shocked me more. Glasses askew, teeth bared, she looked almost savage. Once the last plane had gone over, a stunned silence fell. It made the ringing in my ears even worse. Then all at once, everyone was talking in that jokey, shrill way people do when they've been scared and are relieved it's over. Finally, Cliff let me drag him back to the post office where, once inside, we started babbling with nervous excitement. "If they'd turned their guns on us, we'd all be dead." I snapped my fingers. "Just like that." It was amazing, Olive. Terrifying, more like. The plane was so close, wasn't it? Did you see what their pilots did? It was like the lighthouse was a signpost or something, telling them where to turn. "Did you see what Queenie—" I stopped, reddening. Queenie had come in so close behind us, I thought she'd overheard. Luckily, though, she was deep in conversation with Mrs. Henderson. If Rain wouldn't take her, Mrs. Henderson was saying. He's too busy with the lighthouse. Huh, Queenie tutted irritably. And the rest of us aren't busy, I suppose, so it's easy for me to take her. I wondered who they were talking about. It's probably just his way of saying that he doesn't want her finding out before it's all arranged, Queenie cut in. We mustn't get her hopes up. It sounded rather mysterious to me. Mrs. Henderson nodded. You know how he is, dear. He doesn't get attached to anyone, does he? He'll never marry that one, not after what his father was like when his mother died. Poor Ephraim's seen enough heartbreak to last him a lifetime. We all have, Queenie retorted. Though she honestly didn't seem heartbroken, not like Mum did. She looked as tough as steel. Then she sighed. All right, one more won't make much difference. She can double up with Olive in the attic. Before I fully realised what was happening, there were 3 people, not 2, in front of us. Cliff, Olive, you'd better meet our new evacuee. It was Esther Jenkins. Crikey, Cliff said under his breath. Just our luck. My heart sank horribly. We'd been doing all right here with Queenie these past few days. It felt like we were settling in. Now I'd a nasty sense that was all about to change. Why don't you show Esther to your room, Olive dear? Mrs. Henderson suggested. I'll take her, Cliff offered, seeing my face. Come on, Esther. Sullen and silent, Esther picked up her suitcase. She followed Cliff through the door at the back of the shop that led to the rest of the house. Go with them, Mrs. Henderson mouthed, shooing me away. I shot Queenie a pleading look, but she ignored me. So reluctantly, I did as I was told. As I left, Mrs. Henderson said something I didn't catch. She did what? Queenie gasped. Shh, not so loud, Mrs. Henderson hissed. You're the only house left with any room. I could hardly put her in my goat shed, could I? On the other side of the door, I hesitated before closing it. They were talking about Esther. It was probably a misunderstanding, Mrs. Henderson went on. Esther swears she explained bacon wasn't kosher. That was why she wouldn't eat it. She wasn't making a fuss for no reason. I knew what kosher meant. It was the type of food a Jewish person could eat, according to their beliefs, which must mean Esther was a Jew. Queenie breathed in sharply. That chicken won't be kosher either. None of our meat is. Have you spoken to Mrs. Drummond? I didn't catch the answer. Something was happening upstairs. A door slammed at the top of the house. Then footsteps clattered down the attic stairs, stopped, and went back up again. That's my room, Cliff was saying in a rather pained voice. I'm not sharing with a girl. By the time I reached the first floor landing, Cliff was sounding more desperate. No, Esther, you can't just take over. Something bumped across the floor overhead. There was another thud, a laugh. Stop it, those are Olive's, Cliff cried. In a rush of anger, I charged up the attic stairs. The cheek of it! She'd only been here 5 minutes and was already interfering with our things. Then Esther said, Your sister's got a lot of socks. My heart stopped. She was in my sock drawer, where I'd hidden Suki's note. Put that back, it's not yours, Cliff protested. Esther laughed. Is it a love letter? Has Olive got a sweetheart? I stormed into my room. The floor was strewn with clothes, my clothes. Esther was in the process of clearing the top 2 drawers. She'd also moved my books from the windowsill. What are you doing? I cried. Making space for my things, she said, as if it were obvious. By the way, I found this. Between her fingers, she twirled Suki's note. It had been very recently opened. I licked my lips. Is it a love letter? Esther asked again. No, I stammered. I don't think so. Don't you know what it says? She was surprised. So it's a secret code. Isn't that a bit dangerous? I wiped my palms on my skirt. I knew what she was implying and took a step towards her. Are you calling my sister a spy? Esther Jenkins slowly smiled. I don't think I mentioned a sister, did I? I realised then what I'd done. I'd put my size 5 foot right in it. That's all for today. Hope you're enjoying the book so far and that you'll check in tomorrow. Bye.